Jelly Roll has filed for divorce from Bunnie Xo, and it almost took the world by shock. So I decided that I wanted to dive into their relationship dynamics and break down how when two people fall in love with each other's survival versions, and when a relationship is born out of shared trauma, addiction, or struggle, like Bunnie Xo and Jelly Roll's relationship is, that sometimes that relationship doesn't survive once both partners heal and outgrow those old coping mechanisms that originally brought them together. So I know you know their story, or at least you think you know their story, because the story that we saw and that we watched and that we cheered for, the redemption arc story where Jelly Roll redeemed himself for the infidelity that he committed in their relationship, the story that they are the trauma survivors who found each other and it was just meant to be between them, the story that they are the couple who beat the odds, they are the couple who went to therapy and they did the work on their relationship, they are the couple who renewed their vows, they are the couple who got sober and became millionaires. And they are the couple who seemed to finally have everything figured out in their relationship. And then they filed for divorce. And that story, the survival, the sobriety, the 10 years together, the going to therapy, the beating the odds, that version is beautiful, and it made us invested in their relationship. And that version and that story of their relationship, it was and it is real. So I want to acknowledge that and make sure that I don't dismiss it. They loved each other. Their relationship was real, and they fought for their relationship. But sometimes life, as we all know it, it has other plans. And we saw that on May 2026 when Jelly Roll filed for divorce after being married to Bunnie Xo for 10 years. And when I heard about him filing for divorce, I kind of sat back and I watched the reactions and the comments just kind of pour in all over social media and the internet. I actually turned to Reddit and Instagram and read several of the comments about their divorce news. And Reddit was going wild with saying things like, as soon as he drops the weight, he leaves his wife. I know Bunnie is controversial, but that woman stood 10 toes down for that man, helped him get custody of his daughter, and was with him before fame when he was an absolute nobody and didn't have anything. I doubt he would be where he is today without her. And then other comments, really curious as to what made him file for a divorce. And then it was edited to add, raised his daughter like she was her own when her mother wasn't around, practically the only mother that she has known. And then other comments, he's the biggest dumbass in the world. She picked him up when he was at rock bottom and loved him and his kids like her own. He'll realize how rare that is to find and how stupid he is for trading that for attention. And then other comments, I'm honestly surprised. She's so involved in his daughter's life and they've been trying to have a baby together. Maybe that's typical behavior, having a kid to save a marriage. For the kid's sake, glad that didn't work out. And then another comment, and posting this only 2 months ago, and it's a picture of them dancing and just looking happy and in love. And then another comment, I just had a coworker telling me last week how they have a sweet God-honoring marriage and that he embodies America's old values. And then another comment, a man divorcing his wife after becoming famous and successful, classic. And then another comment, literally just watched her gush about him on Holly Madison's podcast. I'm not surprised, but crazy timing. Another one, after cheating on her and helping him get custody of his child, what an upstanding dude. Another one, but bummer, but not surprised. They really pushed the narrative that she was a ride or die though. Another, why do some men not improve themselves for their family? She's been with you since you were nothing, and now you're tiny bit more attractive and you dump her? And then the comments, they just go on and on and on, especially people hating on Jelly Roll because of how Bunnie Xo stood by his side and how she was there through some of the worst things that a person could go through and the worst things that a person could do to a partner, things that some people would deem unforgivable, and she stood by his side through that. And the fact that they seem to be the couple who defeated the odds of working through all of their relationship pain and dynamics, or at least it seemed like they worked through these things before they filed for divorce. And I know that's a lot to process, and that can be very confusing. And that all of that can send people through an array of emotions like shock and sadness and confusion. And there are even several other comments that I kept hearing the same version of kind of the same things. Things like they did everything right, they went to therapy, they broke generational trauma, that they were supposed to work out. Those type of comments. I kept seeing that a lot, especially on Instagram. And here's the thing that I want to discuss with you today. What if they did do everything right and they fought hard for their relationship, or thought or hoped that their relationship would survive or beat all the odds? But this right here, this divorce is still what happened even through all of that. And I want to put this out there. But what if healing, real healing, which is a beautiful and powerful thing, is the very thing that actually dismantles the very thing it was trying to save? What if the healing is actually what ended the relationship between Jelly Roll and Bunnie Xo? So, hi, I'm Michelle McGowan, and this is Emotional Wealth. And today we are going somewhere that I think is really going to land with a lot of you. Because the story underneath Jelly Roll and Bunnie Xo's relationship shows what happens when two people who are built for survival finally heal and learn to live. So before we go anywhere with this story, I want to tell you why I chose this specific story. Because it would have been a whole lot easier to do a video about Jelly Roll and Bunnie Xo that is just kind of, well, sad or dramatic, or even a story of the breakdown of what went wrong would have been a whole lot easier than what I'm going to give you today. But that's not why we are here today. And that is not the story that I'm going to go through on YouTube today. I chose this story, this relationship, this dynamic, because their relationship is one of the most psychological, transparent case studies I have ever seen in public life. Their story is out there for the world to see. And I mean that in a profound way, because most people, most couples, they go through what Jelly Roll and Bunnie Xo went through. They go through the healing while also trying to fight for their relationship. And they do this in private, not in the public eye. And they do this behind closed doors, without the cameras, without the podcast, without the memoirs. And maybe you have experienced this, or you know a couple or a friend who is experiencing this. And that is why this story matters so much. And Bunnie Xo, through her Dumb Blonde podcast and her 2026 memoir called Stripped Down, she gave us something incredibly rare and raw in it. She gave us the actual psychological data, the real language, the inside view of how her and Jelly Roll are just two people consciously trying to rewire themselves while simultaneously trying to hold their marriage together. And what I really want you to try to wrap your head around is the fact that their story is not just their story. Their story is so similar to a lot of people's stories, like I said, and maybe it's very similar to yours. And no, maybe you have not grown up dealing drugs at 13 years old, and you may not have worked in the sex industry, and you may not have married someone who had a 10-month affair. That might not be part of your story. But maybe you had your own version of survival, and your survival probably looked different from their survival. But it is still a survival story nonetheless. And maybe instead of doing drugs at 13, you grew up in a home where love felt unstable, where you had to earn safety, where chaos to you felt normal, where the people who were supposed to protect you either left you or hurt you, or they did both. And if that is the case, then you're going to see yourself in Bunnie Xo and Jelly Roll's story. Just because the survival strategies are different, that does not mean that the blueprint underneath those survival strategies are not the same. Because I can almost guarantee you that the blueprint under those survival strategies are extremely familiar. That your blueprint under your survival strategy is extremely similar to theirs. So let's start at the beginning. And I don't mean at the beginning of their relationship. I'm talking about the beginning that actually matters here, which is the blueprints that each one of them were handed before they even met each other. So let me start with Bunnie Xo, because I think her blueprint is the one that gets skipped over the most often. So Bunnie Xo, who was born Alyssa DeFord, she grew up in Las Vegas. And on the surface, we already know that Las Vegas is already a city that is built around performance and survival and lights, camera, action. It's a tourist place built for partying and having fun all night and day. But her childhood went a whole lot deeper than the geography and where she was raised. Because when Bunnie Xo was 3 months old, and I'm going to repeat that, when she was 3 months old, her mother, she abandoned her on a doorstep. And I need you to try to sit with that for a moment. And I want you to sit with it not as a fact, even though it is a fact, but as a feeling. I want you to try to feel that type of abandonment, because there is no language and understanding for what that does to a nervous system that is just 3 months old. There is no way for a human to cognitively process that at 3 months old. But what there is, and what we know, is that at 3 months old, Bunnie Xo's body and nervous system got some of her first lessons on love. And that lesson is that the person who is supposed to stay, the person who is supposed to love you the most in the entire world, they left, that they left you. And then we have her father, who fought legally to gain custody of her. And he did in fact get custody of her, and he raised her. But her childhood, it was not safe. It was not loving or secure, because even though she was wanted by her father and he fought to gain custody of her, she suffered verbal, emotional, and physical abuse from her stepmother, a stepmother that her father allowed in her life. So she grew up in an environment of constant screaming, where children were meant to be seen and not heard, where expressing your needs were not safe, where the message was clear even without saying the words, the message that your feelings are inconvenient. So she grew up in an environment of childhood emotional invalidation and emotional neglect, and an environment that teaches a child to suppress their identity, their voice, and their emotions just to maintain peace or to ensure physical and emotional safety for themselves. And when you grow up in an environment like this, and some of your early exposures to love is like this, what do you think happens? What happened to Bunnie Xo was that she built walls, high walls, walls that would be impossible to get through. And how could she not? Because when you learn as an infant that the people who are supposed to love you will abandon you, and then you learn as a child that the people who are supposed to protect you will hurt you, then you stop wanting to be saved. And what do? You start saving yourself. So by the time she was an adult, Bunnie had adopted a ferocious hyper independence. So what did she do with that? She entered the sex industry, and she leaned on cocaine and prescription pills to cope with pain that she had never been given the tools to process, that she should have never even experienced in the first place. And then what happened? She operated under an unspoken code that she has admitted and talked about herself, a code that you do not need anyone, because needing people is painful, and that's how you get left and hurt. And now let's flip and let's talk about Jelly Roll, who was born Jason DeFord, and he was born in Tennessee. Jelly Roll was the youngest of 4 children. Jelly Roll's father, he worked hard doing things like selling meats and running a bookie operation on the side. And his father was present, and he was there for Jelly Roll in certain ways. But Jelly Roll's mother, she battled profound mental illness and severe substance addiction and abuse. And because of this, she was often there in body, but absent in every way that matters to a child's nervous system, to a child's psyche. And she was absent in every way that a child really needs. And I want to share something that Jelly Roll has said himself. And I want you to really try to process it and sit with it. Jelly Roll said that he fell in love with music because of his mother, the same mother who suffered from profound mental illness and substance abuse. And he said that he fell in love with music, which is now his career, because music was one of the only things that temporarily eased his mother's suffering. Not his suffering, his mother's suffering. He loved his mother so deeply that his career was built from something that he learned helped his mother. But that deep love that he had for his mother was always tangled up with helplessness, with unpredictability, and with specific kind of ache that comes from loving someone who cannot consistently show up for you. He was faced during his entire childhood with this agonizing conflict of loving someone whose capacity to care for him was hijacked by her chronic complex diseases, which leaves you as a child with just breadcrumbs of affection. And then what happened? His parents divorced when he was 13 years old. And whatever little stability that he had, it crumbled in that divorce. So what did he do? He started dealing drugs the same year at 13 years old. He had his first juvenile detention at 14 years old. This is a child. And then it was just a domino effect after that, where he had a decade-long cycle of incarceration, of aggravated robbery, of drug possession. He also described the fact that he believed for years that he was disabled and that he was meant for nothing more than to be in a jail cell. So then let's take a step back here, okay? So you have Bunnie Xo with a factual blueprint of being left on a doorstep at 3 months old by her mother, who suffered by her own mother, who also suffered from verbal, emotional, and physical abuse from her stepmother, and grew up with a father who did not protect her from that abuse. And then you have Jelly Roll with a factual blueprint of growing up with a father who tried to be there and with a mother who suffered from mental illness and substance addiction, and whose parents divorced at 13 years old, where he then turned to deal substances himself. So take a minute and take that in. And I want you to try to notice something about both of those blueprints, because we have this factual blueprint and information on their lives. And then we have the messages and the beliefs and the feelings that come along with these blueprints, the things that are not so black and white. And neither Bunnie Xo or Jelly Roll received what every child's nervous system requires in order to develop secure attachment. Neither of them had a caregiver who was consistently safe, who was emotionally available for them, and who was responsive. And children, they need that. They need that in order to learn what secure attachment is so they can securely attach to other people. Children need that safety, that emotional availability, that responsiveness in order to be secure within themselves so they can enter loving, healthy, secure relationships as adults. And unfortunately, what Bunnie Xo and Jelly Roll both received instead was the total opposite of that. They received chaos. They received absence. They received unpredictability. They received pain that was wrapped up as love, as what love was supposed to be. And what did they do with that? They each built the only thing they could build from those materials. They built their survival selves. And Bunnie Xo's survival self, it said, I do not need anyone, that I will provide for myself, that I will not let anyone close enough to ever leave me again. And Jelly Roll's survival self said, I am not worth much, that I will numb the pain, that I will stay in the chaos because at least chaos is familiar to me. I know chaos. And then backstage at their country saloon in Las Vegas in 2015, these two survival selves, they boom, found each other. So because of this, I want to talk about something that I think gets misunderstood a lot online. And that is, and something that is talked a lot about online, even though it gets misunderstood, which is the concept of a trauma bond. Because when people hear trauma bond, they often think that it means that the relationship is not real, or that love that comes with trauma bonding is not genuine. And that is not what it means at all. Because a trauma bond is a psychological attachment that forms through a cycle. And it forms through a cycle of intense connection, then rupture or conflict, then reunion. That trauma bond cycle includes highs and lows. It includes chaos and reconciliation. And trauma bonds, they form most powerfully between two people who are already carrying unhealed wounds. And they do this because the intensity of the bond, it mirrors the intensity of the pain that they grew up in. So in other words, it feels like the familiar childhood love that they had. Because for a nervous system that was wired in chaos and that was wired in intensity and that was unpredictable, that trauma bond, it feels like coming home. And for Jelly Roll and Bunnie, the early markers of a trauma bond are textbook. Because they met in 2015, they were friends at first, but by July 2016, they had reconnected romantically. Then 1 month later, just 1 month now, that's it, Jelly Roll, he proposed on stage at a concert to Bunnie Xo. And that exact same night that he proposed, they eloped in Las Vegas chapel while, in Bunnie's words, they were blackout drunk. And now I'm not saying that to judge them. I'm saying that because clinically, that speed, a 1 month together proposal, and then marrying is a signal. Because when a nervous system has been wired, like Bunnie Xo's and Jelly Roll's has been wired for chaos and abandonment, then slowing down to them, to that nervous system, it can feel unbearable. So then relationships tend to happen intense, and they tend to happen at a fast speed like theirs did. And that intense fast track of a trauma bond, it's not reckless. It's just two nervous systems saying that I finally found it. I finally found someone who feels like home. So I need to lock it down before they just disappear. And that is exactly what Bunnie Xo and Jelly Roll did. They got married and they locked it down. So then let's fast forward to 2018, where Jelly Roll had a 10-month-long affair on Bunnie Xo. And that is not just a one-time mistake. He had a sustained, active, covered up betrayal. And Bunnie, she has stated in her memoir that the pain of that affair, it brought her to the darkest place that she had ever been. That during that time, she even contemplated ending her life. And I want you to take a step back and I want you to think about what an affair does to someone with Bunnie Xo's blueprint, with Bunnie Xo's childhood, with her nervous system. What does it do to someone who learned at 3 months old that the person who is supposed to love you with everything that they have, they will abandon you instead of keeping you? What does it do to someone who spent her entire life building walls to protect herself from exactly this kind of thing happening, from this type of pain? So then finally, you let someone in, you really let them in, you married them, and they betrayed you anyways. Imagine what that does to a person. Because when this type of betrayal happens and you have her type of upbringing and her type of nervous system, it does not experience that as just he's cheating, he was a cheating husband. It experiences as confirmation of the oldest wound that Bunnie carried, that maybe you carry, which is, see, you knew this would happen because everyone eventually either leaves you or they lie to you. So you knew this would happen. And that is what that affair actually hit in her. It didn't just hit the marriage. It hit the blueprint. It hit the attachment wound, the beliefs, the messages that she grew up with, that she believed about herself. But here's what makes their story different from many other stories that I've heard that are just like this, that are very similar to this. They did not just split up and move on once the affair came to light. Instead, Jelly Roll, he got in his car and he drove to Las Vegas and he asked her for another chance. And they both said yes to something that is extraordinarily hard to say yes to. They both said yes to go into therapy, to digging in real deep, targeted trauma therapy. They both agreed and they said yes to. And they didn't just say yes to let's continue to try to keep this relationship. Let's try to do this by just talking about our feelings. They wanted to dig in by actually going into the root system, by working on their individual's blueprints, by trying to rewire what had been built based on those blueprints that they received. And I want to take a moment and really acknowledge something here. What Jelly Roll and Bunnie Xo chose to do in that season of their marriage, it was rare. It was not just brave, it was rare. Because most people, when they hit a breaking point that severe in their life and their relationship, they either leave the relationship or they stay in the relationship and go back to the same old patterns that led them to where they are in that relationship. But what these two people did was something most people never ever do. They chose to actually look at themselves, to work on themselves, and to heal themselves. Bunnie has talked openly about the specific therapeutic modalities they used while they were in therapy. And I want to walk through them because I think they matter. I think they're important, not just for understanding this couple, but they're important for you too, to have this information, to know. So the first therapy modality that she spoke about was called somatic experiencing. And they did this type of therapy because both of them grew up in high stress, unpredictable households. So their nervous system had been wired in this fight or flight type of mode. So talk therapy alone cannot reach that kind of fight or flight wiring of the nervous system, because our body, their body, it holds the blueprint. It does, not just the mind. And the talk therapy really goes to just the mind. But somatic experiencing, it works the body too. So somatic work taught them to track what was happening in their physical bodies during conflict. So they could do things like pause, breathe, and ground themselves instead of letting a flooded nervous system make decisions for them. And this allows them time to calm themselves down in order to have an actual productive and healthy conversation, because nothing healthy or productive will come out of an activated or flooded nervous system. The second therapy modality was internal family systems, or also called IFS, which is sometimes called inner child work as well. And IFS, it operates on a concept that I personally find deeply true, a concept that our minds are made up of different parts that are often frozen at an age when a specific wound occurred. So when you are fighting with your partner, sometimes you're not actually two adults having a disagreement over like dishes or trash or whatnot. You are two hurt children playing out their oldest fears with each other in that moment, that disagreement that you're having. So Bunnie had to learn to recognize the part of herself that was 3 months old, abandoned on a doorstep. The part of her that when Jelly Roll pulled away even slightly, she heard the footsteps and it took her back to her mother leaving. And Jelly Roll, he had to learn to recognize the teenage part of him that turned to chaos and self-sabotage every time things got too peaceful. Because peaceful for him felt dangerous when you grow up never knowing what was coming next. And then the third therapy modality was what Bunnie called radical accountability, which is, it's not blame, it's opposite of that. It's not a victim and villain type of story, but it's both of them turning on the lens to themselves and asking, what role did I play in creating this dynamic? What patterns am I bringing to this? What in me keeps attracting or accepting this? And that is an extraordinary mature thing to do when you are in the middle of real pain and betrayal like infidelity. And it worked for years. It all worked. It worked from 2019 forward. They rebuilt their lives. Jelly Roll got sober and his music career, it exploded into something that neither of them could have ever predicted. And simultaneously, Bunnie built her own empire with Dumb Blonde. And they stopped operating under the old free will relationship that they had built, which Bunnie has said never really was freedom. It was just two people who did not know how to trust each other, dressing their avoidance up as liberation, meaning that instead of them recognizing or admitting to themselves or to each other that I am terrified to let you in, all the way in, or to trust you, they reframe their emotional distance and mistrust as something positive, as something enlightening or modern. And they called that liberation, freedom, free will. And through the therapy and work, they moved towards real intimacy, towards actual vulnerability in the relationship. And in August 2023, which is 7 years after the Vegas elopement that they had, they went back to that same chapel while they were sober this time and intentional this time, and they renewed their vows. And that vow renewal was not just a celebration, it was a declaration that we are rewriting this story, that we are not those same people. So from that, I want to talk about something that I think is the most important thing in the entire video. Because here is the question that I keep hearing, which is, if they healed themselves, why did they end? Why did their relationship end? And if they did the work, why didn't their relationship actually work? And I want to offer you a framework and some insight that I don't think gets talked about enough, if at all, which is the fact that when two people meet in survival mode, when they meet in the thicks of the chaos and in pain and in the thick of the unhealed wounds, the relationship that forms in this type of meeting is built on a specific foundation. And that foundation is shared survival. And the unspoken contract between these two people, it says, I will hold you in your chaos if you hold me in my chaos. And there we understand each other because we are made out of the same type of hurt. Even though we have different stories and different backgrounds, we are still both made of pain and hurt. And that connection, that form, that is real. That love was real. So don't let anyone tell you that it's not. But it is also a connection and love that is load bearing in ways that are not visible until something shifts and changes. And what changed for Jelly Roll and Bunnie was that they healed. They healed individually and they healed profoundly. They did the work so completely that by 2026, Bunnie wrote that they were finally stable. That they were finally stable financially and emotionally after a decade of work together. And then, with the chaos gone and with the survival instincts quieted, they were left with the most difficult question that a couple really could ever face, which is, who are we to each other now that we're not in survival, now that we are healed and no longer in survival? Because healing, it does something to the choreography of a relationship. Because when you no longer need someone to be your regulator or your co-regulator, when you no longer need your survival partner, when you no longer need your anchor in the storm, and when you can stand fully on your own 2 feet, that relationship, it shifts from necessity to choice. And when I see people in the comments saying things like, Jelly Roll lost weight and he got his veneers or teeth done and he started thriving in his music, when all of that happened, he just dropped Bunnie. But what people are actually seeing was him exiting survival mode and entering into being secure and healed self. And sometimes when that happens, people are left behind and relationships get broken. And that exiting survival mode and entering healing, it's actually really healthy. That is interdependency, which is what we want in life. But when the relationship that came before that was built primarily on survival foundation, that shift can reveal fractures that were always there, but were never visible because survival was filling and fueling those cracks. And the experts that I've seen that weigh in on their split have noted something consistent. They have noted that them filing for divorce, and I mean it occurred a month ago, May in 2026, but we're just now really hearing about it almost a month later. That they're filing, it wasn't a dramatic blow up like we hear all of the time. There was no final type of betrayal or an infidelity again. What happened between them was a lot quieter and in some ways more painful than that. They looked at each other as two healed, full, independent people, clear-eyed people, and they realized they were no longer wanting the same life. And I call that outgrowing the original contract that was written and sealed in survival. And it is one of the most disorienting experiences as a human being can have. People come to me all the time while they're on their healing journey. And we have talked about if their healed version no longer loves or needs their partner in the same ways. And that is a real legitimate concern because it does happen. And it happened in Jelly Roll and Bunnie Xo's case because they did everything right. They healed, they showed up, and they still ended up here in divorce. So let me name a few of the specific dynamics that I see at play that contribute to this type of ripple effect, even after doing all of the things, but yet still ending up in this place of walking away from the relationship. The first dynamic is divergent coping mechanisms, because in survival mode, couples cope in tandem. They cope together at the exact same time. So they share the same chaos, the same defenses, the same fortress. And as individuals heal and grow, their coping mechanisms, they evolve. And they often evolve in different directions. Where one person, they move towards stillness, towards solitude, towards deeper inner work, while the other person moves towards forward motion, towards purpose, and towards external impact. And those two paths, they're not wrong, but they are not always leading down the same path together. The second dynamic that I see is this dismantling of codependency. So what I see in Bunnie's blueprint is that she created extreme self-resilience. While Jelly Roll, he created a pattern of seeking validation and needing someone to anchor him. And in the early years of their relationship, the two patterns, they fit together because Bunnie was the anchor and Jelly Roll needed the anchor. And that's what people were saying in the comments when they were saying things like, she stood by his side through everything and helped him with everything, etc. That's what they were seeing in there. But as Bunnie did her own healing, she stopped needing to be needed by someone. And Jelly Roll developed his own secure foundation, so he no longer needed someone to be his anchor because he became his own anchor. And that codependent scaffolding that they had, it came down. And what was left was two autonomous people who had to ask the tough question of, do we still choose this? And then the third dynamic that I see, and I think this is one of the most tender ones, is the incompatibility that only becomes visible in the quiet. Because trauma and survival create an emotional intensity that can feel like profound compatibility to people. And when you are both in the trenches together, the bond is fierce and it's undeniable. But when the trenches, they're gone, and when life is genuinely peaceful and stable, and you are left to face with who you both are in ordinary life, then sometimes, but not always, but sometimes, these two people, they realize that the intensity that they shared was the survival, and it was not the core. And without the survival, the core, it becomes different. It was different. And that is not failure. That is what healing looks like when it is doing the full work. And there's one more chapter in this story that I do not want to just gloss over, because I think it is psychologically significant in a way that has been underreported. Before the divorce filing in May of 2026, Bunnie and Jelly Roll spent 6 months undergoing IVF treatment together. They did this privately, they did this quietly, and they did this in the hope of having a baby together. And I want you to understand what that decision represents from a psychological standpoint. So we have two people who both grew up in environments where childhood was not safe, where they were not protected, where love was conditional and unstable. And then we have these two people making the choice to try to create another life together, to give a child the childhood that they were denied. Bunnie has spoken about wanting to give their future children a childlike version of themselves, a safe, peaceful, present version of what childhood was supposed to feel like to them. And there is so much longing in that, so much healing intention in that. And there's also something else worth naming. The decision to pursue IVF, which is emotionally and physically grueling process, at the same time that a relationship is quietly fracturing, it tells you something about how much they were still trying. It tells you how unwilling they were to give up. It tells you how deeply they both wanted what they had been working towards. But the IVF, it did not result in a pregnancy. And months later, the divorce, it was filed. And I'm not saying that those two things were directly connected. That's not what I'm saying. But what I want you to sit with is the emotional weight of that sequence for a moment. The emotional weight of that grief in that. The fact that two people who survived so much, who fought so hard, who wanted to break the cycle, those same two people experienced that kind of loss. And then the end of the marriage happened in the same exact season as that. That right there is a profound amount of grief to hold. And I want to name it because sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply acknowledge how much something cost people. So let me pull this all together into something that I hope you can carry with you. There's a thing that happens in relationships that begin in survival. And I want to give you a name for it so you can recognize it in your own life. And I call it the survival ceiling. And the survival ceiling is the point at which a relationship that was built on shared pain, a relationship that was built on shared chaos, and a relationship that was built on shared coping mechanisms, it then reaches the limit of what it can hold. And that is not because the love was not real. And that is not because the work was not done. But this is because the architecture of the relationship was designed for a version of both people who no longer exists. And Jelly Roll and Bunnie Xo built something extraordinary out of very broken materials. They built it with their hands, through pain, through betrayal, and through years of hard work, through unflinching work. And when they became people who were no longer made of these broken materials, they were no longer these broken people operating out of the same broken lens. And here's what I need you to understand about that. Healing, it is supposed to change you because that is the whole point of healing. But when the relationship was built by your wounded self, for your wounded self, then the healed version of you may not fit inside of that relationship anymore. And that is not a tragedy, or at least it's not only a tragedy. It is also evidence that the healing worked, that the cycle that they both carried, the abandonment, the addiction, the chaos, the survival, that cycle does not and will be continued. They built something different. They chose differently. And even in the ending, they appear to be ending with a level of consciousness and maturity that neither of them had access to when they began their relationship. And that right there is emotional wealth. Emotional wealth and being secure within. It's not about the absence of pain. It's not about the perfect outcome, but it's the expansion of capacity. It's the ability to face what is true, to grieve what is true without destroying yourself or each other, and to choose what comes next from a grounded and secure within place. So here's where I turn towards you, because I'm not talking about Jelly Roll or Bunnie Xo anymore. I'm turning towards you and I'm talking about you. I want you to think about the relationship you are in right now, or the relationship maybe that you just left, or the one that you keep going back to. And I want you to ask yourself honestly, what was or is the foundation of that connection? Was it or is it built on genuine compatibility, on shared values, and on the ability to grow together? Or was it and is it built on shared survival, on recognizing each other's wounds, on the intensity of two people in pain finding each other and calling it home? Because both of those things can feel like love. Both of them that can be real, but they are not the same thing. And here's the harder question. The question that takes real courage to think about and to sit with and to process, which is if the chaos of your relationship, if it disappeared from your relationship, and if the survival instinct that you've been programmed with, it got quieter, and if the intensity of your relationship settled into something calm and ordinary, would you still choose this person to be in a relationship with? And would they still choose you? Or have you been staying in the relationship because the bond, it feels unbreakable, and not because you truly want the relationship, but instead it just feels familiar, and it is what your nervous system learned to call intensity love? And an even harder question, which is, are you afraid of healing fully? And that's not because healing is scary in theory. But because somewhere underneath everything, you know that healing might change what an unhealed version of you fits into right now. Because that fear, it's real. And it is one of the most human fears there is. The willingness to heal fully, even when you do not know what you will be or who you will be or who you will love on the other side, that is one of the bravest things that a person can choose to do for themselves. And Jelly Roll and Bunnie Xo, they chose it. And it cost them something enormous, but they chose it and they did it anyways. And I do not think that is a sad ending. I just think that is what it looks like when two people finally completely put down the survival blueprints that they were handed and they choose themselves. And that right there, to me, that's emotional wealth. Emotional wealth isn't about the relationship that lasts forever, but it's about the life that is finally, genuinely, authentically yours. So again, I'm Michelle McGowan, and this channel is Emotional Wealth. And if this video struck something inside of you, I want you to share it with someone who is in the middle of this, someone who is struggling with their relationship, someone who is trying to understand why the love was real, but it still didn't work. Someone who is grieving a relationship that looked like healing, but ended anyway. Just someone in a relationship or ever been in a relationship, period. Give them the language, give them the information. And I also want you to like and subscribe and hit the bell, because this is not the only story we are going to go deep on. There is so much more to come. So thank you for watching, and I'll catch you on the next.